If you don't know what it is that you bring to the perception, how do you know what isn't you in that perception? What's out there in the world has the structure that it has because of the way that we ask the question. Our programs are not designed to create thinkers, they're designed to create repeaters.
In Greek, the word for question, which is erotisi, comes from the same etymology as the word eros, which is love.
Brain is doing is filtering. It's constraining your experience. It's not producing it.
So from your experience, how important is self-exploration, self-inquiry? So studying consciousness in a direct way for becoming perhaps more able to study consciousness as an academic field, or to that end, to that effect, study any sort of academic field, physics, philosophy, and so forth?
Well, that's a great question. And if we have an hour, I think we could fill up the entire hour on that.
Good.
The importance of that is incredibly broad reaching, and there's probably 3 or 4 different aspects that are each worth talking about unto themselves. For me, know thyself has been kind of a personal tenet. I have always been fascinated by my own way of knowing, my own thinking, my own thought processes, my emotions. And I remember as a kid in sort of high school age, so mid-teenage years, deliberately spending a lot of time trying to understand what I thought and the way that I thought and why I thought the things that I did, and became appreciative of the fact that without knowing that, you really don't have much of a gauge to understand what is yourself versus what is beyond yourself. Because everything that you take in is filtered by your own perceptions, by your own experiences, emotions, needs, and so forth. So without starting from a premise of knowing yourself as well as you possibly can, you really don't have much of an opportunity or an ability to know anything else. Because without that, you can't take away the filter that is you to understand what is on the other side, right? If you don't know what it is that you bring to the perception, how do you know what isn't you in that perception? So it's a fundamental thing, independent of academics or anything else, just as a matter of going through life. If you want to do the best that you can to understand what's really happening in the world around you, the other people that you talk to or beyond, right? Whatever, you have to understand what it is, what expectations and biases and so forth that you're bringing to the table. Jumping to the other end of the spectrum, and this is something that maybe we can get into a little bit more, but I'll kind of just state it right now as I
Sure.
believe this is the case,
Yeah.
and I have yet to have anybody who pushed back on it. But I'm not defending it right now, so we can go to that. The idea of what the universe is, if you look at, for example, the evidence that talks about the nature of time and space, invariably, if you're really open to the data that is out there, what you will find is that these concepts are our own cognitive tools. They are our narrative tools for understanding our experiences, describing those experiences to ourselves in terms of memory, describing them to other people, and so forth. So there's overwhelming evidence that time and space itself is a cognitive tool, which, by the way, is consistent with quantum mechanics for that matter. Quantum mechanics says that time and space, these are operators on a wave function, and they're not fundamental properties, right? You get these things because you make a measurement You ask the question, and that's what you say. Well, if I were going to describe this in terms of space, where would I find the electron? And it goes, oh, well, if you want to do it that way, then okay, right? So when you look at that idea that what's out there in the world is really has the structure that it has because of the way that we ask the questions. Um, what you the sort of the inevitable conclusion is that we give shape to the universe in the form that it has, which is to say, when you look at, for example, the equations of physics or anything else, what we're really discovering in that is ourselves, right? It's our mapping of meaning onto the experiences that we have that give rise to the universe that we live in. And so when we study physics or study biology or study psychology or frankly study art or anything else, what we're studying is ourselves. We're studying the way in which we map experience into meaning and establish meaning in that respect. And so it's the most profound aspect of know thyself, the way that I think about it, right? Know thyself for the benefit of knowing oneself, but knowing thyself is in fact ultimately the pursuit of knowing anything that is sort of meaningful within the context of a human life.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating, and how you tied in straight into the topic of science. And I'm just gonna stick a bit to this latter point, because we often consider that notions or parameters such as space and time and matter, these are objective qualities of an objective universe somewhere out there. But what you're suggesting, and I think what many of us experience through direct self-inquiry, is that once we get to know the knower, without having that knowledge, we cannot know what standing the knowledge of the knower has, right? If we don't get to know who is it that knows, we cannot be sure of the quality, the essence, the level of truth and validity of the known, of what we're knowing. And once we study the knower, consciousness, we get to see, experience through direct exploration that really all those parameters, as you so eloquently put it, are ways that consciousness creates in itself those kind of categories of or those units of meaning, sort of like lenses that we wear or glasses that we wear. And
Yeah.
once we wear those glasses, then the universe appears as time space, right? Once we wear the glasses of those concepts, we interpret the universe in a way that we see objects, or energies or whatever. So,
And with emotions and in fact the very idea of objectivity is really tied into that as well, because if you think about what makes something objective is consensus. That's the nature of objectivity. So if you talk to a whole lot of people who are around you, they all agree, then you will say that there's some objective truths. So for example, like physical stuff, right? Like this is a physical thing and everybody agrees that this is a physical, okay, that's objective. But if you talk to everybody who's got a like-minded, you sit in your own echo chamber, almost anything feels objectively true. But the idea of objective versus subjective is really a question of, do most people agree with you? Then you call it objective. And if not everybody agrees with you or they describe it differently, then you say it's subjective. But the reality is, it is all human experience. The only thing that we actually know is the things that we perceive, that we experience, that we sense. That's the only thing that you ever really get to work on. Everything else is just extrapolation, including the idea of objectivity.
and the idea of space and time. So
Right.
space,
Yeah.
time, and matter, are those also interpretations or phenomena appearing within consciousness that then we all agree that they are objective and therefore we create them? So is the world that many people would consider objective, and especially scientists would consider objective, is it a phenomenon or a way of viewing arising from consciousness and within consciousness?
Yeah, and when you look at sort of cultures that are relatively separated from the rest of the world, and you find that there are distinct differences in the way that they experience things, what they see is sort of obvious truth, right? Which for your standard mainstream scientist, you say, does a tree have a soul? And they'd be like, I don't even know what a soul means because I haven't been able to put it under a microscope, and therefore, no, trees don't have souls. Where if you go to some culture where people live very much in touch with the land, within harmony, and so forth, and they don't get into can I put it under a microscope questions,
Mm,
most likely they will just have, well, of course it has a soul, right?
mm,
The Native American traditions viewed things very, very differently. And they all shared sort of a same common backbone in that variations from tribe to tribe, of course, like variations within a set subcultures. But it's a different kind of world with different experiences that maybe people who grew up in our culture literally would not be able to perceive because they've sort of eliminated the possibility of that. For example, if you look at some of the amazing anomalous things that happen for example, in Brazil, in an area that's got some incredible stories behind it, right? Well, why in Brazil? Well, it's quite likely that the reason that a lot more interesting things happen in Brazil is because they're open to the idea of it. They don't raise
mm,
people to assume that anything that's like that automatically can't be true, and therefore they keep their eyes open. Whereas we tell our kids things like, well, don't worry about that spooky sound. That's just your imagination, which is perhaps the worst thing that anybody has ever said to a child ever, to say
mm,
just your imagination, because there couldn't possibly be anything more valuable to the human nature
yeah.
than imagination.
Mm,
But we tune it out and we train people to not be aware of certain things. That's
mm,
just your feelings. Don't pay attention to them. What?
mm,
I
mm.
mean, that's your feelings. That's what could be possibly more important to pay attention to than your own feelings, right? Uh, that's probably why we've grown into such a sort of an alarmingly dysfunctional society, is because we don't pay terribly much attention to our feelings for the most part. So
Mm.
we're not even consciously aware when something doesn't feel right or what have you.
Wow. So basically, you're suggesting that materialism, the way we know it, or positivism in science, but also in the humanities, that has also spread there. It seems to me that you're suggesting that, and I find a very valuable way of seeing it and putting it, is actually a cultural paradigm. It is a very specific
Yeah,
cultural worldview that purports itself as the only objective and valid one vis-a-vis, what people think in Africa or in India or in Tibet
right.
or in Latin America or indigenous people, let's say of America or of Greece to that effect. So we're actually dealing with a cultural phenomenon and we often find, however, at universities nowadays, especially in certain types, let's say, of academic institutions, because we cannot put all universities under the same
First,
umbrella, of course, but in many, many academic institutions, we observe that people are not even open to
right.
this reflection. They're not even open to discussing the possibility that what we take as given, that this is a material world, we're just material bodies, we are like these machines that arise and they're going to die, and we don't know what happened before, we don't know what happens after. Imagination, emotions, and all that is just fictions of human brain, of the human brain. So, uh, why do you think that universities or academic institutions still hold on in certain cases with such, I'd say, fanaticism
Yeah.
against the idea of exploring those topics, those areas?
I think there's a couple of different factors that play into that. Um, One certainly is just money. A lot of institutions rely on getting grants. Grant givers typically have a specific, and I mean, this is very much opposed to the way science is supposed to be working, but
Mm,
most grant givers are giving grants for the purpose of somebody proving something that they already believe to be the case. So they are not usually, like I said, just to say it out loud as somebody trained in the scientific method, it's insane, but it is the way that it is. That people want you to show that whatever it is. And if you say, I'm going to show that, then they will give you money for it. And if you don't say that, you're not going to get grants. So there's a part of it that's financially driven. You're expected to toe the line because if you don't, it impinges on your ability to bring in money. There's a part of it that is certainly cultural as well, because the academe has a culture to it, and attracts people who are really interested in getting the answer, right? That there is one correct answer that's out there, and they are going to find that one correct answer, and everybody else is wrong if they don't agree with the one correct answer. So there's a huge emphasis on being correct. So if you come up with an idea that contradicts somebody else's idea, they're going to react very, very badly to it, because they feel, instead of looking at it as exploration, which would be the ideal, they view it as a threat, because they have sort of built their own credibility and self-worth around the idea that they've come up with an explanation, a picture, whatever it is, that is going to be correct. And if it turns out that's not correct, then they sort of like, well, then I was wrong. Which ideally, as a scientist, you'd be like, yay, I was wrong. I mean, you should be excited about that, because if you were wrong, then you're learning, right? I mean, that's the whole goal of science, is to be wrong as much as you possibly can to inform you in learning what isn't. That's the whole scientific method. But it's not how it tends to work when married up with human psychology, and somebody says, well, this is my theory, and if you say that it's wrong, so my background comes from the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, which was a program at Princeton University, and dealt with or faced a lot of adversarial attitudes at that university for what they were doing, including people who would say things that were so almost comically inappropriate, such as and this was a Nobel laureate who, in looking at their work, said, I wouldn't believe it even if it were right. And you're
Oh,
like,
wow.
what? Did
Wow.
did you somewhere in here miss the whole goal of science? Right? But this is the mindset, is people have a vested interest in their model being correct, and they don't want anybody to take it down. And on the one side, you can understand, or at least appreciate, maybe why that's the case, right? Because that's a lot of personal investment that they now have to go back through and figure out, where did I have an assumption that maybe wasn't so accurate? What do I really need to, it's a huge amount of work. And the more foundationally different it is, the further back you have to go. So if you say, look, the model that you're using, which is built on the idea that time and space are an objective truth of the universe rather than a cognitive tool, well, you're going to have to go really far back, and you're going to have to rethink the way that you approach a lot of stuff in your life, right? And so this is something that I eventually came to realize, like, when I look at the data, when I look at the idea of, or the experiments that look at syntropy, that say that we're actually are receiving influences that are sort of appear to be causally, the cause is in the future and the effect is now, right? So it's retrocausal as much as forward causal. That we have precognitive dreams. We have all these sorts of things that say, look, we do interact with times that are in the future. It's not a one-way street in all of this. Well, now you got to go back and really rethink all this stuff that you said, well, I thought I knew everything. At least I had this basic model that if I did something and there was a cause, and that caused something else, I knew that I did the thing and then something else happened as a result. Well, now you have to acknowledge it's possible that the result is really the cause and influenced you to do the thing that you did now that led to the thing that was there. If you are familiar with the idea of synchronicities, it's a little less alarming of an idea that maybe we are all moving towards something that's driven by some future purpose. But if you're not, what a terrifying idea, because you really now are forced to go back and go, everything that I thought I understood, I now have to, even down to the way we use language. It's very challenging.
Mm.
And it's also, it can be very exciting if you remain open to it. I have gone down that road and I found it wonderful. And yeah, I've had to rethink a lot of stuff that just, I don't think I got right when I was doing my physics classes. Like, I don't think that they quite had it. But
Mm.
that's fun. You know, I know more now than I did then.
Mm.
Um, yeah,
So there is a resistance, there's a fixation to an identity, which is a psychological process. And then there is resistance to the transformational fire that's going to ignite out of questioning one's assumptions. Because obviously, as you mentioned, it's not just that the career is going to be touched or the model upon which a theory was based, but then one ponders, wow, what does that mean about my life if
right.
I can work, the future interacts with the present in a reverse causal way, or if to that end, there are parallel dimensions that every point in time can be a parallel dimension to which I can flip right now. So, the universe is much more interactive than
Yeah,
what we were taught. So that requires actually a spiritual process. This is what we call spiritual path. That requires the hero's journey, as we would say in Greek, or the Socratic attitude that, Socrates even towards the end of his life, he said the very well-known precept. He didn't say it exactly in those words, but this was the meaning. He said, "There's one thing I know, that I do not know anything." Right? So he was like 70, 80 years old, and he was like, This is my attitude. My cup is always empty. I'm here to
yeah,
all them question my assumption. I don't know. I come open to the question and to the unknown of possibilities. And it's interesting that in Greek the word for question, which is erotisi, comes from the same the same etymology as the word eros, which is love, right? Like eros, love forces us into this unknown space. It shakes us up. It requires us to
yeah,
transform. True love, right?
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
interestingly, the question does the same thing, and it can be very unsettling on a psychological level when we want to control. We want to control life. We want to have it all figured out. But as we understand that, we see that the way a lot of modern science works then is is not scientific at all, right?
No.
Because we would define science. How would you define science? How would you define science, episteme, and what for you are kind of the basic precepts or attitudes of science, if you could summarize them?
Yeah. To me, the core of science is the scientific method. In this respect, so the scientific method, pardon me, if people are not familiar with that, the scientific method is basically one of exploration, where one plays, which is to say you observe, you have some kind of experience, what it is, and then you look at that and you say, huh, I wonder what that was all about. And you come up with some kind of model and say, well, maybe it's this. Maybe this is the way things work. And then you experiment and you try it, right? And you see, is that the case? So you think of it as from the perspective of a child who says, aha, I think I got to figure it out. I've noticed that every time I pick something up and I let it go, it falls. And I got it. So they build up this model. Pick it up, it falls. Pick it up, it falls. And they test it. You pick up different things and you try it and it falls. And
Mhm.
all of a sudden you're like, I got it. I've got the whole world. And then one day somebody hands them a helium balloon and they let it go and it doesn't fall. It rises. And all of a sudden they got to go, whoa, wait a minute. All right. I have to go back. I have to revise. Most things fall, but not everything falls. Right. And so they go back and they explore. And this is the scientific method. You design, you come up with an idea. In science, we call a hypothesis. And then you design experiments that allow you to test that hypothesis. The good scientist remembers that they never prove anything. literally science is incapable of proving things. And one of the most embarrassing things that scientists do is say, well, science has proven that. Well, then you don't understand what science is, because science never proves. Science fails to disprove, or it disproves. And if it disproves, it said, okay, that theory, that's not it, because I now know a counterexample. If you haven't disproven, all that means is that you, to the extent of your experience, have found everything's relatively consistent. But that doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's consistent within the experience realm that you have. And if you have broader and broader experiences, the better off you're going to be at that. And in fact, that is sort of the key element to your earlier point about what is really the trouble with people is, if you think that your goal in life is to come up with the absolute truth, all of this stuff is going to be really scary. On the other hand, if you think that your goal in life is to be an explorer and to have fun exploring the yourself and the universe around you, you don't have any of these problems. You find something that didn't work, you say, well, that wasn't about me. I didn't understand that. So I'm going to continue to explore. And you have a good time with it. That's a good scientist. And in fact, I wrote an article a little bit ago about what is sort of the best scientist. And I would argue that our very best scientists are infants. Infants inherently know the scientific method. They do it all the time. They take things, and I'm going to put that in my mouth. What? Oh, interesting. I'm going to come up with an idea. I'll put the next thing in my mouth. See what, oh, no, that wasn't so good, right? And they're always exploring, they're always revising, and they're experiencing things and designing experiments in their own way to do this. What happens is somewhere along the way, we grow up, unfortunately, in all the wrong ways, which is we shift from this idea that we are fun-loving explorers to insecure people who feel that the only way to have value for yourself is to be considered to be right or an authority or something like that. And once you've crossed over that line, now you're old. It has nothing to do with biological age or how many years you've been on the planet. You've crossed over that, now you're old, because now you've gone from being an explorer to being somebody defending a hilltop, and saying, well, no, you can't mess with my model because whatever. And which is really unfortunate, because there really is no need to do that. We could all be very happy explorers and continuing to work together and to do all these sorts of things. The other part, going back to your original question of what is science. So this is, to me, the core of science is somebody following the scientific method to better their understanding. There are other answers to that question that people give. For example, the body of knowledge that people have come up with and written down as sources, where some people say that's science. The periodic table is the science. And that is one way of looking at it. I don't really like it personally. I'm not sure that from the perspective of living fulfilling lives, for example, that we're doing a whole lot better with the periodic table than when we thought that the elements were earth, wind, water, fire, right? Like, have we actually improved the quality of our lives in this? Well, we've made some really cool devices. I don't think we would have gotten to making cell phones if we had not had that way of looking at it. But has it really made us happier as a species? I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah. Has it fulfilled the basic telos, the basic goal of human life,
or
which
is it
is
just distracted
lasting
us from it?
happiness, wholeness? No, yes, exactly. So, it's fascinating once we realize, and more researchers, academics, people into spirituality also, we come to realize the limitations of the old academic paradigm and the old academic structures that kind of defend this old worldview against this change, this almost, awakening of the collective consciousness in the world that gets us back to being explorers. I love the way you put it, and actually reminds me the words. I'm going to be making these Hellenic references all the time.
Well, that's such an important thing, is to realize that what we're talking about is sort of going back, or awakening out of this sort of current scientific regime. In many ways, is going back to wisdom that we already had, right? I mean, this way of looking at the world, even this whole idea of linear time, this is more or less an industrial revolution
Absolutely. Yeah.
age thing. This is not that old. This is a couple of 100 years old. But there are systems of knowledge that go back thousands and thousands of years that had a lot to say, and really did a good job of understanding what we were. Uh,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
That's why we return more to indigenous wisdom, be it from, the East or, Greece to that effect. And I mean, our ancestors here in Greece, they used to think that time is a circle, right? Circular idea of time. And even the word chronos, comes from chronos, right? The deity. It means it has these three elements of nous. So it's mind.
Mm,
It's the R in Chronos is the flow, and the X, Chronos, X and flow are and nous, meaning how the mind, the flow of the mind goes and creates. X always creates kind of categories and the fourth
mm,
dimensional
yeah.
idea of time, of view of space time, right? The four dimensions of space time. So even in the etymology or even the ancient texts, we find this information that, time is an appearance in the flow of mind when the mind sees things through the perspective of separation and of different dimensions. And then again, the Egyptian oracles, the priests that said to the ancestors of Socrates that, Hellenes, you're always children. But Helene is somebody who's on a conceptual level is like the enlightened mind. So a mind that is devoted to light, a mind that is open to the light of exploration is always like a childlike
Mm,
mind, but in the sense of how you beautifully presented it, being open to the unknown, familiar with the unknown, non-attached to previous statements, theses, positions, and then, enjoy the ride, play
yeah.
along, have fun with this, find
I think
happiness through this. This is so important. It seems that we have lost happiness, that
yeah.
that joyful element in universities, right?
I think we've gotten very distracted by our cleverness. This topic came up, and I forget in what conversation where we kept talking about intelligence, 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 and the distinction between sort of having a fine intellect versus being clever, and what really traps you in many cases is we get very enamored with our own cleverness, our and we forget some of the core elements of what it means to be alive, right? So we get focused on, oh, well, I've got a good explanation for this and I want to explore it more, and it becomes more and more resolved and we get finer and finer details, and we get lost in the details. And then we forget that a lot of those details, or maybe even all of those details, were things that we created in the first place. And we think, well,
Mm.
that's the goal of the exploration of all of this, is to come up with it. And if you do that and you're having fun with it, okay. As long as you remember that the goal is to have fun. There's nothing wrong
Mm.
with being clever. But if clever takes you away from being wise, you're not really serving your higher self. Or it's tough to say higher self because it's more foundational too, right? So it's higher self and it's lower self. It's more the more encompassing
True
self.
being, your true
For being
being.
your true
Yeah,
being.
your true
Right.
being. Yeah.
Clever is fine, but it should never take away from the heart. You know.
And that's another point, how much universities or, say, scientific circles have lost contact with the heart. And
Yeah.
the other day I was having a discussion with Anne Baring, who's, a 94-year-old female British author writing on those matters. And we're talking about the return of the goddess and, the connection of mind heart to male female qualities in the Western culture.
Mhm.
So that's a very important aspect as well. And before we go back to consciousness, because I would like to, ask you a few more questions about your own
Sure.
approach and your understanding. Since it flows that way, let's follow the ROI of the nous. Let's follow the flow of the mind. And perhaps mention a couple of things about what we referred to as the divided life in a recent publication we did with David Lorimer and Galileo Commission, which is called A Call for a Renaissance of the Spirit in the Humanities, where we basically create this short manifesto presenting these ideas in a concise way. And one of the things we detected was discussing amongst us and with various colleagues that many of us, at one point or another, you mentioned something about your own experience at university. We experienced this division, first of all, in our lives that, we had to keep some of our true interests, our joyful explorations away from academia because academia didn't permit or dismissed, sometimes very arrogantly, any alternative interest or area of expertise that didn't abide by its own established narrative. But then again, that also implied situations of certain form of discrimination or bias. I call that epistemological discrimination, right? One is not discriminated because of their gender or, financial status or ethnicity, but they're discriminated against their epistemologies or their interests, right? Which is another form of discrimination. So have you experienced, I know you mentioned something like that, but I would like you to elaborate if you want a bit more on this. Have you experienced that bias? Have you experienced in your life that division? And how did you work around it? First of all, in your
Yeah.
life, if you ever experienced this division, and then, in your interactions professionally, academically.
So I have a bit of a unique advantage in this respect, in that I, growing up, observed that in full force in what my mother and in Robert John experienced when they were doing the work at Princeton. And I saw, on the one hand, you hear this whole thing about tenure and academic freedom. You get tenure and now you can study whatever you want.
Wow.
And looking at the experiences that Bob had, as a tenured full professor, dean at the engineering school, world-renowned leader in aerospace technologies and all these sorts of things. And then one day saying, wait a minute, there's something having to do with mind and intentionality and all these sorts of things. So that's worth studying. And he went and he did this. And he said, I have to study this. There's an obligation. There's a mystery here that deserves to be looked at, and I'm going to do it. And I saw the price that he paid for that.
Which
And
was
which was that he eventually was asked to step down as dean, and
wow.
he
At Princeton.
at Princeton, because they didn't like his research program. Which is ironic because honestly, I think if Princeton ever is going to be remembered for anything 100 years or 500 years from now, it's going to actually be the PEAR program. But right, they didn't, even though on the they would say, oh yeah, well, academic freedom, but the truth was it wasn't, right? He was under tremendous pressure, and the only reason he kept doing it was because he was, truly the ultimate professional and the ultimate scientist who said, there is something here that needs to be studied and we're going to study it. And he did it, but at tremendous cost. And I saw that, right? I saw what they had to put up with from not just critics who just didn't like the work, but who were outside, but critics inside the university, from everything, just because they just simply didn't like that he was studying this thing that wasn't supposed to get studied. So in my experience, I realized what this was going to be like. And I kept a fine separation in my academic work through most of my career. So on the day job side, I was studying a variety of things over the years, a lot of data science, nuclear physics, data fusion, cybersecurity, acoustics, and my career has kind of gone all over those. But I never took that stuff and put it with consciousness studies. They always remained their own things. I did my day job and I did my consciousness studies. And I never asked anybody during in my day job environment, could you please support a program where I would want to study this sort of thing? I never asked the question because I saw what had happened before. So I expect that had I probably would have faced the same kind of fierce problems that everybody around me that I've seen has faced. because I've known a lot of people who've run into that and really struggled with being told, no, you're not allowed to ask that question.
Wow.
And even
Wow.
today, I run the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, and people come and they say, oh, well, I'm really interested in studying this. Where can I go to study it? And invariably, I'm forced to say, study it on your own time. Because if you want to do it in the academic world, it's gonna be harder than just doing it yourself.
Wow.
You're going to face more challenges. So go do whatever it is that you're going to do academically, and then do this as well. But maybe don't mix them right now. All that said, I will say that now as I'm getting close to retirement age, now I still don't try to mix these two in any professional way, but
Wow.
I have gotten to a point where I realized, like, well, if no one's going to fire me, that's not my fear. But if I were fired tomorrow, I would be okay. Like I could live the rest of my life on the retirement savings that I have, and I'd be okay. So I'm like, you know what? So I don't need to be quite as cautious. And as a result of that, I've started having a lot more conversations with people. Again, I'm not asking them to give me money. I'm not asking them to fund a research program. I'm not asking them to do anything, but I have conversations with them. And what I have found, to my delight, is that a lot of people, if approached the right way, are actually surprisingly open to it.
Mm.
It is a lot. Now, again, like I said, money, right from much earlier in the conversation, money is a problem. You stay away from money because people get very, very testy when you start talking about money. And will I get money or will you get money? And then, but if you're just talking to people on a one-on-one basis, informally, and you say, well, you know what? The world isn't quite so materialistic as we're led to believe. Here's a couple of pieces of evidence for this. Um, People are actually amazingly open to it, and they will come and they'll say, yeah, I've had experiences like that. I had a dream that such and such, and it came true. Or my my relative uh, passed away or had some kind of problem, and I knew it. I just knew it at that time. And they'll share things that defy the materialist worldview.
Mm.
And you'll realize most people have these experiences. Like not like 60%, like 90%, 95%.
Yes.
There's actually the number of people who have not had some kind of metaphysical experience in some form is more like 5% or 2%. It's a very small fraction of
Wow.
people who have not actually had that kind of experience, either personally or with somebody who they know and trust and believe. And so that's comforting, right? And it means that now our challenge is to normalize it, right? So that it's okay to have the conversation without being quite so careful in the way that you bring it up. Because I have practiced for years figuring out, because of my role in ICRL,
Yeah.
how am I going to bring this up in a safe way,
Wow.
right? I don't want somebody to feel challenged, but I want them to feel safe. And so I practice this, and literally for years I practiced trying to make that conversation a comfortable one. And it works. And so it's really a question now of how do we normalize it to the point where everybody can have these conversations without that fear. And I think once we get over that hurdle, things will change a lot. Um,
Wow. So isn't it, I mean, it's ironic to think that it's kind of a tyranny of a minority if the direct experience of the 2% of the 5%, as you put it, is mandating or in a way try to silence the direct experience of 90 or 95% of a population. Something is off there. And I mean, it's going to be an expression of an opinion here, but in my opinion, it's not okay. Something feels not okay when we are afraid to bring up a valid question or topic of conversation in the context of a circle or of a structure that is devoted to free thinking, right? So if we're afraid to
for sure.
freely express a free thought in a context that's supposedly, purportedly supposed to be a space of free thinking, modern, scientific, open-mindedness, then something is really not going right, right? To be afraid of the freedom of
Yeah.
thinking.
Well, there's pardon me, there is a lot that has transformed in the academic world over the years, as we've unfortunately drifted from an institution or set of institutions dedicated to free thinking and mind expansion to certification granting, right? Because it's become a business. You
Yes.
come, you will get your certification. We're not going to do anything that's going to risk somebody coming by and saying, you're losing your certification as a university because you said X, Y, Z. And it's a fear factor.
Yeah. But sorry, but who is that that's gonna control what
It's
is right or not right to study?
the people with money.
Oh.
That's usually where it is. So it is, as you were
So there
mentioning,
may be
alluding
political
to, it's a,
purposes behind what we allow to study or not. There may be then a political agenda behind what is permissible and non-permissible
an
to study
entire
in a similar
an
way than in
entire
medieval
population.
times, right?
Yeah.
I
An
think it's
entire population of open-minded critical thinkers has not ever been in the best interests of the people in authority, right? Like you usually don't want to have 90% of your population having their own thoughts. And that's what university was originally intended to do, was to give people the opportunity to be open-minded and have their own thoughts. So yeah, if you have a small number of people who are in power, uh, that's probably not what they want to see their schools doing. And if you look at the programs, and not just in the universities, and I don't know how it is in Europe because I didn't go through elementary school or anything in Europe, but in our public school systems, we are not focused on teaching our kids how to be critical thinkers. We're teaching them, you need to repeat what I tell you and repeat it the way I tell you, and then you get an A. And if you don't repeat it the way that I tell you, then you don't get an A. So we're not, our programs are not designed to create thinkers. They're designed to create repeaters. Yeah.
That's it's profound realization, and I'm sure that many of the people watching us right now have also come to the same conclusion, but perhaps there are others that never heard of it. It's in such a stark way. So I think that is important. But at the
Yeah.
same time, as you mentioned, there is a shift. We are experiencing almost like a planetary
Yeah.
shift of consciousness, and things are changing. Those conversations are happening, and to a very large extent now with the decentralization of the focal points of knowledge with the rise of social media and internet and so forth, there is almost a deinstitutionalization of knowledge. Hope I said that right. There is a focus away from the institution, and there are
Yeah.
just different ways of knowing that are becoming almost equally or more valid. We see that especially in younger generations. People now don't need to get a degree to have a career or to have money. This is definitely something that we're experiencing happening right now. So that has also led to the discussions moving away from the university to other types of institutions or other types of forms of communications like social media. So there is this change. And I think, and I'd like to hear your view on this, that sooner or later this trend is coming into universities, that modern academic institutions are also gonna have to evolve along with the evolution of discourses and interests of
Yeah.
society.
I think that this kind of change is inevitable. And the reason is because a lot of what's gone on, and going back to something that we mentioned before, how much can you distract yourself from things, right? If we have a need, I think, as a human, as part of the human experience, we have a need to be connected, to recognize at some level that we are not just a set of atoms. We have an interconnection with the world around us and so forth. And at some point, there is no amount of distraction that is going to take you away from the pain that comes from feeling completely disconnected. You can feel a little disconnected, and it's sort of like like when my daughters are young and they, you get a cut on the finger or whatever, right? And you put a Band-Aid on it, and then you like, and here's a lollipop. And okay, the finger still hurts, but they're paying attention to the lollipop, and eventually the pain in the finger goes away and it's fine, right? But at some point, there's no lollipop big enough if the pain is big enough. And what we are experiencing is we continue to feel more and more disconnected. The anxiety, the sense of purposelessness, all these things at some point become so profound that there's no distraction that's big. You just can't buy enough stuff to allow consumerism to distract you from the fact that you're utterly anxious and miserable, without feeling like you have some connection with it, some purpose, and so forth. And I think as we get to this point, I mean, it feels like we're kind of there now, but it's probably going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. People are going to have to really shift and start saying, look, we need to do something different. We need to start subscribing to different ways of learning, as you were pointing out, that maybe I don't need to go to schools to do this. And ultimately, that same thing that was holding schools in check, or academia in check, which was money, right? Well, if you don't get students, you don't have any money, right? An academic school with no student body is not really an academic school anymore. And so if people just say, I've had enough, I'm not going to go to your school, I don't need your degree for the way that you said it. What I don't need the degree at all, for that matter, because I can be successful without a degree. So the only reason that I would go to a school is if you're offering something that actually is the original purpose, giving me a mind-opening experience. And now things will shift, because the business model of the whole thing has to change. They're not able to sustain themselves as degree granting institutions or credentialing institutions. They have to shift into actually providing some other service that is meaningful to the human experience, which is my exploration of ideas, opening your mind, being exposed to different ways of thinking, and so forth. Now you've got a different structure in place that hopefully will revise it. But it'll probably be a pretty painful process for the academic world as it goes through that, because there's going to be a lot of universities that will shut down as a result of that, or have significant strife, I would think. I mean, like anything, it's tough to change.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you can avoid it.
That circles us back to the beginning of the conversation regarding consciousness. So, a part of that type of education, which is actually spreading and spread as an inspiration, but as also an inquiry amongst many people, is explorations of one's own self. So exploration of consciousness. So how would you define consciousness, and what is a way that you practice self-exploration? And third, I hope you will remember the questions. The third is, and how do you bring that into your work or your study as a physicist?
So you remind me if I forget all the questions.
Okay, yeah, I'll just note them down.
In terms of what is consciousness, there's a variety of different. So I went into physics because it was very different than my natural way of thinking. Normally I'm a very holistic thinker. I went into physics to learn very reductionistic thinking skills, and a lot of my time over the years has been trying to reconcile those. And so I try to work from an evidence-based perspective, which is to say, it's one thing to just sort of have a theory, but I want to try to take into account all the different things that I've come across over the years. And certain pieces of this include things like we clearly are able to influence the universe around us through our intentions. If you're going to ignore that, you're just doing it because you just don't like the answer. But like, there's just such overwhelming evidence at this point, scientific evidence, that our intentions influence the world around us. You can't get around that. There is overwhelming evidence that we can have conscious experiences with no neural activity. Like it's just been demonstrated, right? I mean, people who have been under measurement and having literally no brain function or any body function at all, if you think, well, it's in the heart, it's not in the brain, no, it's the whole thing, and yet can relate experiences that happened while they were in a state of literally no functioning whatsoever, right? So they're perceiving things while they weren't there. People who have out-of-body experiences who are able to go somewhere else and experience things in other places, or remote viewing, and all these things. You have to look at this and go, well, whatever consciousness is, you can't call it a brain thing because it happens without the brain. They're just, and again, I'm just being brief about it. There's so much more evidence to this. So when you ask, well, what is consciousness? For me, I have to start with, it's not a physically, it's not manifest from a physical process. In fact, much more compelling is looking at it to say that all this physical stuff is simply a description of something that is fundamentally not physical. We call it physical because it's a model that works well. We can describe it with language. We can communicate experiences. It's a great model. And I'm not suggesting we don't talk about our physical beings. It's a wonderful metaphor, but it is still a metaphor.
Wow.
So consciousness is, to me, the core of what makes an individual unique as an individual, which is not to say that we are all distinct, because the same argument can be made to say that your consciousness and my consciousness are essentially two facets of a larger vision of whatever that is, right? We're just two sides of this infinite-sided kind of thing.
Or two waves of a same ocean, in a way.
Exactly. Each one is unique in that it is its own wave, but it is all still part of the same ocean. And we have our own experiences, we do our own things, we have our own way of looking at things, but we're fundamentally connected, but we're unique. And the consciousness is basically what describes or encapsulates the uniqueness of a particular, and this is a terrible word because language fails in all this, perspective on the larger, holistic, greater totality of all things that is consciousness. And that is what consciousness is. It's sort of the identity of what makes something unique. So me as the Jeff that's talking to you right now has this consciousness. This particular mug has its own consciousness as well that identifies it as a mug. Not very much like my consciousness at all, because it's not very much like me. Your consciousness is mostly like my consciousness, which allows us to have communication, to share experiences. You have some experience, you say, I love this piece of cake that I just had, and I can go, aha, I know what that is. I know what it's like, because I've loved a piece of cake. Whereas this coffee mug probably has not loved a piece of cake. It probably has nothing in whatever constitutes experience for a coffee mug, right? I don't know what that is, but whatever that is, it's not very much like mine.
So we can say that it's our knowing, the knowing nature of our being, the
Yes.
knowing aspect of our being.
Yeah, and I would say even the experiencing aspect of our being, that which has the experiences. Now, to jump to the next question, I think, but maybe the last question, what have I done to sort of explore this?
Yes.
Most of my, so I'm weird this way because I grew up in an environment where
We're
we
all
talk about
weird.
consciousness
We're
all
all
the time.
weird.
We're all weird in our own way. I embrace this weirdness. I'm very thankful.
Yes, of course.
But so from a very young age, I would have practiced trying to get out of this consciousness and understand what a different consciousness would look like. So it's starting with something as simple as, well, what if I were a different kind of person? What if I were older than I am, younger than I am? What if I was female? What if I was this culture? What if I was that culture? What if I was whatever it is? And then over time, branching that out. Well, what if I was a dog? What if I was a cat? What if I was an owl? What if I was a tree, right? What if I was a planet? What if and it continues, right? And each one, as you explore it and try to get into it more and more, you start to have an appreciation for how those consciousnesses differ. Take the mug, for example. The mug, whatever consciousness is for a mug, right? That's a different kind of thing. It doesn't probably relate itself to time and space the way that we do. Similarly, take something a little more dynamic, call it a river, right? Something is doing something, right? A river's, whatever the consciousness of a river is, right? It's not going to be based on having sensations like we have sensations like touch and feel, right? It's probably not going to identify itself exactly that way because it's part of a water cycle, right? How does the river decide that it's not a river anymore because it went into the ocean or because it became vapor that rose up into the atmosphere, or rain that came back down and landed on a mountain and flowed down, right? How does it identify with itself? And work through this, which I think if I had trying to get into the consciousness of a river when I was 14, I would have found very challenging. Now that I'm 58, I find it easier because I'm less tied to the precepts of what consciousness would need to be. And as I've gone through my life, the range of to what extent I can have explored has expanded. So for example, when I was 14, I think I would have found it very challenging to try to get into the consciousness or experience the consciousness of being a river because it's quite different than what I am today. But as you practice more and more, you learn to distance yourself or dissociate yourself from the things that are human consciousness like and to expand out. And then and I think what I was saying was just that as you go further, right, things that, for example, a river at least is still physical in some sense. Well, what about things that are not physical? What does it mean, for example, to look at the consciousness of laughter or sadness or anything of that nature, right? Which doesn't even have a physical manifestation, or the consciousness of something that is very archetypal, like the hero in the hero's journey, right? Which is not a thing. It's not a person, really. It's an ideal or an archetype, right? What does it mean to embody the consciousness of an archetype? And to me, this is a lifelong exploration of trying to do this.
Wow.
And then, and I
And
think
do you meditate?
I do, at various times in my life, more or less. I used to meditate very, very regularly when I was in my teenage years, and did a lot of energy-based meditation at that time. As I got into the parent portion of my life, which was a very distracted time, I didn't meditate terribly much. I'm finding in the last 6 to 8 weeks, I'm finding meditation has become an essential part of staying sane, because otherwise it's too easy to get caught up in sort of the craziness that's going on around us. So I've tried, and for me, I've tried very much to use different styles of meditation because I always want to explore. So, on the one side, meditation such as calming one's mind and searching for an inner silence versus meditation that is allowing the inner dialogue to continue, but stepping back and away from it and watching that dialogue as sort of the outside observer into it. And you get the idea. Like there's a lot of different styles of meditation. So I try to do a lot of different ones.
Wow.
And I think that's a part of putting this into one's daily life, which I think was your third part of that question, which is how
Yeah,
does it,
and into physics also, like into your
yeah,
your personal life and also the scientific
and into the scientific.
life, right?
So for me, it's become a very important part, both personally and in terms of physics and science and so forth. Um, at a personal level, maybe the most important aspect of it is in recognizing what consciousness is, and that my consciousness is not unique from your consciousness or anybody else's. It changes the way that I view my interactions with people and other things around me, such that it's much more, it shifts into being more like talking to a little bit of yourself, right? You're more negotiating with some other aspect of yourself. And that helps me to stay focused on having kind of a positive outlook on things, right? Like I may disagree with somebody, but I also disagree with myself. There's a part of me that really likes chocolate chip cookies, and there's a part of me that really wants to lose weight. And those are not in alignment with each other, right? But it doesn't mean that I need to hate myself for it. right? And so if I'm talking to somebody else and I say, well, I believe this and I don't believe that and I'm whatever, and you look at that and you go, okay, I may not agree with you, but you're still part of the same overall whole that is the organism, right? Like, I don't, it doesn't bother me so much that my stomach and my liver maybe don't see eye to eye on things, but I don't want them fighting with each other. I don't want one of them thinking that it can do the job of the other. I
Yes,
want both of
exactly.
them there, even if they're
Yes.
different. And so to me, thinking about consciousness the way that I do helps me to remember I'm one cell in the larger organism. And I need to keep that in mind because I'm not responsible for the whole organism, but I really want the whole thing to be healthy. Even the cells that aren't working the way that I would work, I still want them to be healthy.
Of course.
Uh, and so at a personal level, that's valuable. Scientifically, it's much more intellectual for me. I find it very valuable when I'm solving problems scientifically because it gives me a perspective that allows me to really dig into what are the assumptions that are going into this. And if I really got those assumptions right. So I do a lot of assumption questioning, and I do so because of my interest and focus on consciousness, realizing that most of what we experience is based on assumptions. And if you don't have the right assumptions, you really can go very far afield in terrible ways. All these things, somebody was just mentioning that there's an organization that just put hundreds of thousands of dollars into asking how is it that the brain is manifesting consciousness? And those of us who have been studying it for a while go, the brain doesn't manifest it. So spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to figure out how, when we know that that isn't even a process that happens, is a total waste of hundreds of thousands of dollars because at best, you're going to realize that you didn't learn anything. And at worst, you're going to think that you did learn something. And you're going to have solidified your perspective in a
Mm.
worldview that's fundamentally flawed,
Mm.
because you've now invested that much more of yourself and your resources into something that just was never going to give you the right answer anyway, right? And so being able to back up and go, is that really right? Like for me, especially one of the things I do a lot now is artificial intelligence and with ChatGPT and the generative AI kinds of things. This has become a major question. Oh, well, we should use ChatGPT to solve this problem and that problem, and the other problem. What's the assumption that goes underlies all this? What is the nature of what it is that you're applying, as opposed to what you think you are applying? So being able to ask those questions, I think, as a scientist and say, are you really designing a good experiment here, or have you put an expectation into your experiment that's going to prohibit it from giving you really useful results? And that's
Yes.
how it plays for
And,
me.
and in that way, philosophy is the science of sciences because
Oh yeah.
once, science studies process or something, something specific object, let's say of life, and then the science that studies sciences assumptions. It is the science of sciences, we could say, as Aristotle did, and that is philosophy as science or science as philosophy. But
Yeah.
this is also an integral part and a very important part of science.
In physics, there's what they call theoretical
Yes, theoretical
theoretical
physics.
physicists
Yeah,
and experimental physicists, and we say, well, the experimental physicist should be working based on pardon me,
bless
the insights
you.
of the theoretical physicist. But the truth is that all of physics is just applied philosophy, right? Like
Yes,
that was the starting
exactly,
point,
exactly.
right? It
Yes,
was philosophy,
yes.
and then physics is just like, okay, let's take that philosophy and figure out what we can do with it, and where it holds together and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and one of the fundamental premises and assumptions of science is the scientist is the knower, is knowing who I am, supposedly, or I know that I am an observer, or I know that I am a human body, or I know that I am a mind or a consciousness. And we bring all those assumptions about what is the subject that precedes the objects of science. And then here comes Apollo saying, oh, you have to study this ultimate premise behind knowledge, which is, yourself and consciousness itself.
Yeah.
So, so actually, this is an integral part of science. Like, if we cannot skip that part,
Right. Oh,
and let's, I mean, if you have a couple more minutes,
sure.
just a final point here, because you mentioned that based on your direct experience, one can observe, and if one is very rigorous with one's observation and self-observation, that consciousness does not arise from the brain, but indeed the brain appears in consciousness. So there is valid reason to consider the possibility that consciousness is the prima materia out of which matter, what we call matter, organic matter, is created. But there really isn't no direct evidence to suggest that consciousness arises from the brain, because the very experience of the brain comes from the experiencer that is a consciousness. So we have never experienced the brain outside consciousness,
Right.
right? But we have experienced consciousness outside a
About the
brain.
brain. Right.
So
Yeah.
so I mean, I know that, and there's a lot of people out there talking about this from a direct experience, self-inquiry point of view. But you also mentioned that there is evidence about this, that, you speak about it with a certainty as a scientist, and you give good confidence that, no, we know that now, that consciousness is not a byproduct of brain activity. Would you like to comment on that a bit more, or tell the audience a bit more
Yeah.
about, because it may not be common knowledge for everybody?
For sure, certainly. The reality is that there are a lot of experiences that we have that don't fall into this idea. Some of them, what I consider to be um, suggestive experiences, are things like remote perception and so forth, where we're getting information that comes from uh, some source that is not physically located anywhere near the brain. It's not connected to any kind of neural firings or electrical impulses or anything else that ever connect with it, right? Like, it's from somewhere else. And I consider that to be compelling, but not the strongest evidence. To me, the
No,
strong,
because I'm sorry, because one could say that, there is a perceptive ability of the brain that we don't yet know that can pick up
right,
objects, located thousands of miles away.
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But there are other sources that to me are much more compelling. For example, if the brain has been rendered completely inert, it's brought down to a temperature where there literally is no neural activity in the brain or in the body, right? You can take the whole body down where there's no heartbeat. There's no, you can have MRIs or whatever it is that are CAT scans or whatever it is that, I'm not a medical person, but whatever it is that's monitoring actual brain activity, and there's none. And then you revive that person, and that person can tell you what was going on while they were out, right? The brain wasn't doing that. That awareness that came from that cannot have been in the brain because the brain was not active at that time as a physical thing with, firing impulses and all the rest of that. It's just
This is in near-death experience, right? Or people that
well,
have
these are reports. I have never had this experience because I have not been in a death situation, right? But
good
there
for you.
are, but yeah, at least so far. But there are lots of reports of these. I became familiar with them because we recently released a book. It's probably sitting behind me somewhere. One of these piles. An author had brought together a lot of reports from other sources. So this guy had gone. In fact, he's giving an ICRL meetup tomorrow, but we won't have the edit of this in time for anybody to know that. But
What's his name?
his name is Robert Trayer, and the book is called Verifying Spiritual Reality. And we published it last year, and so I read it 3 or 4 times as the editor for it. And what he did was he did an amazing job of bringing together all these kinds of reports that you would otherwise have to go off and read like 500 books, which is what he did, right? That cover these experiences reported by doctors and other personal experiences, but also from the medical community of people who have done these sorts of things and had reports of somebody who wakes up and says, yeah, I understand that you had such and such happen, and I remember where you put my false teeth into this drawer. Like, this person was not clinically alive when all of that sort of stuff happened, and yet they are reproducing this information perfectly. And more than what you would normally expect, for that matter, like being able to understand how people were feeling in the room and so forth. A huge body of research has been done over decades and decades on near-death experiences where people are relating information that they simply couldn't have known any other way, right? Or children who are born with memories from other lives. There's probably one of the more famous ones was a child who had the memories of I think World War II, but it might have been World War
Yes.
I. I don't remember the details.
Yeah,
World
those
War
are
II fighter pilot, right? Well, how would those memories have possibly gotten into that child if all that was happening was just neurons firing back and forth? There literally is no way of doing this. It's outside of space. It is outside of time. There is no explanation. And people who maintain that the brain is manifesting consciousness are doing so simply because they're going to ignore those pieces of evidence. You have to ignore that if you want to say that it's just, well, chemicals going on and that's what it is. At some point you're like, well, you know what, you can conclude anything if you're willing to ignore whatever you want, right? Talk to a flat earther for a while and you will find out that some people are capable of ignoring a great deal to hold on to the beliefs that they want to have. um, I don't know what to say to that, right? Like,
yeah,
in the
yeah,
same thing, if you say, well, no, I'm sorry, consciousness is just emergent from the brain, well, that doesn't match up with any of the evidence. If you look at, for example, what happens when people have psychedelic experiences, right, taking psilocybin and all the rest of that, they have these wild, major conscious experiences, right? Well, wouldn't you expect that during this massive change consciousness experience, you would have incredible brain activity? Well, that's not what happens. During those experiences, brain activity subsides. The brain quiets. It does not get livelier, it gets quieter. And when you look at that and you say, well, what are the implications of that? It's probably, well, I'll say it's logically more consistent to say that what the brain is doing is filtering experiences, not and conscious awareness, not producing it. So that the more active the brain, the less connected you are, the more filtered you are to the universe around you. That's what the brain is doing, which doesn't
yeah,
make it a bad thing, right? Because that's the human experience, to have one life, to have this life. The experience of Jeff going forward is my life experience, and my brain keeps me focused on that. And when the brain quiets down, I've never taken psilocybin, but I have fallen asleep. And when my brain quiets down and doesn't do the same things it does when I'm dreaming, my experiences are not really Jeff-like. They're all over the place, right? I have a much
yeah,
broader experience. So things like that, if you look at it logically, say what the brain is doing is filtering. It's constraining your experience. It's not producing your experience. So
mm,
there's a lot, there's a
great,
lot
great,
of
yeah,
reason
yeah.
for viewing it differently.
Mm. Perfect. That's beautiful. And that's why we call them organs, right? The organs are played by someone, or the organs that,
There you go.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, organo means utensils, like something, a utility, something you use,
Mm,
right? So who is the user of the organs? Like who
yeah.
plays the organs? Apollo holds the lyra, light perhaps plays the different strings of consciousness. And older civilizations found those mythological ways, those archetypal ways to condense that wisdom that comes from a quiet mind, a still mind. And definitely our civilization in the West is, or like say in major cities, people are in the mind, like
Yeah.
brain activity that produces
All
an
intellect. But
yeah.
at the
So
cost of, yeah, that's going back earlier where we say sometimes you're a little too clever for your own good, right? When you get lost in the cleverness, you lose the point.
Yeah.
And sometimes being simpler allows you to get to the point more directly without quite
Yeah.
as terrible a labyrinth to navigate to get there.
Great. Yeah. So let's get out of the labyrinth with the simplicity of Ariadne, like just a simple string, just a cloth, just a stillness can go a long way. So it's beautiful how all of those elements that we discussed combined, this issue of culture relating to nature, to wisdom, to joy, to exploration that makes our lives happier. And in a way, that kind of environment that integrates the heart, that integrates relationship, that integrates, our humanity and our childlike nature. It seems that all that can play a very important role in having a wiser type of science and education. And I believe that you're one of those people in our generation that you're working towards that. You're offering a lot to humanity's step towards that path. And it's been really a pleasure to have this fascinating conversation with you. I feel,
Likewise, thank you.
yeah, I feel wonderful. And thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. My pleasure.